now brings you something to think about.
Shalom and greetings. Thank you for tuning in to Something to Think About. I'm his servant, Jeff Gaines, and this episode of Something to Think About is entitled The 400-Year Prophecy, Part 1. It's safe to say that practically the entire world has been told of the story of the 400 years of bondage suffered by the children of Israel in Egypt. We will allow Scripture to validate Scripture so that we can grow and move from just knowing to truly understanding the 400-year prophecy shared in Genesis chapter 15, verses 12 through 16. Let us read Genesis chapter 15, verse 12. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. Genesis chapter 15, verse 14. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. Genesis chapter 15, verse 15. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Now let's give some context to this passage of Scripture. This is a part of the Abrahamic covenant that Yahweh Elohim made with Abram. We will focus on understanding the dream of Abram. We will start by identifying the who. Who is speaking to Abram? Scripture validates that it is Yahweh Elohim. This is shared in Genesis chapter 15, verse 7. And it reads, And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. Yahweh Elohim reveals in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, that Abram will know for a surety his seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. Interestingly, both the word know and surety mean to know in the Hebrew. Now we need to know who is Abram's seed. Scripture validates this in Genesis chapter 17, verses 18 through 21. That the Abrahamic covenant seed is only with Isaac's seed. Let us read Genesis chapter 17, verse 18. And Abraham said unto God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. Genesis chapter 17, verse 19. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. Genesis chapter 17, verse 20. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. Genesis chapter 17, verse 21. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. In addition, we need to understand the where. Where is the land promised in the Abrahamic covenant? Scripture identifies this land in Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 through 21. But note, The land that is not theirs is not identified here. Let us read Genesis chapter 15, verse 18. In the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Genesis chapter 15, verse 19. The Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Kadmonites. Genesis chapter 15, verse 20. And the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Rephaims. Genesis chapter 15, verse 21. And the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites. Interestingly enough, the land that Isaac's seed will be in is not only not theirs, but makes them strangers. Yahweh Elohim goes on to share in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, Abram's seed, which we now know from Genesis chapter 17, verses 19, and Genesis chapter 17, verse 21, is Isaac. His seed will serve them, and they will afflict them. First, Yahweh Elohim reveals Isaac's seed will serve them. Them are the people of the land they will be strangers in. And them will afflict Isaac's seed. This reveals the prophecy of Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 concerning Isaac's seed. It is also of paramount importance that we understand the word afflict. The Hebrew definition for this word is to bestow labor upon anything, to be afflicted, oppressed, depressed. With this information, we're able to grow and move from just knowing to understanding what Yahweh Elohim is revealing. Yahweh Elohim is sharing with Abram that Isaac's seed will have labor bestowed upon them. They will be oppressed and depressed by the people of this land. Understanding this insinuates that to serve would mean Isaac's seed would be slaves. It is important that we grow and move from just knowing to understanding the scripture, because the grace of Yahweh Elohim does not leave this enslavement, this affliction, oppression, and depression without a time period. Notice, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, Yahweh Elohim shares with Abram that this enslavement, this affliction by the people of this land will be for 400 years. After 400 years of enslavement and affliction of Isaac's seed, Yahweh Elohim shares in Genesis chapter 15, verse 14, that he will judge those people. The Hebrew definition of the word judged used here is to condemn, to punish. Scripture goes on to share in Genesis chapter 15, verse 14, that after the judgment, Isaac's seed will come out with great substance. Yahweh Elohim concludes by informing Abram that he will live a long and peaceful life. Notice how next in Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, that Yahweh Elohim seems to switch to a more immediate issue, as if what he was previously sharing would be in the distant future. Scripture shares in Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, the imminent issue was that in the fourth generation they shall come hither again. Let us identify who they are. They would have to be the seed of Isaac that has been the subject of this dialogue. So, the seed of Isaac would return to the place Abram was at the time of the Abrahamic covenant in the fourth generation. This is of great significance because it identifies the first generation of Isaac and his covenant seed after him, which includes both Esau and Jacob. According to this prophecy, only Jacob, later named Israel, would be Isaac's covenant seed. Only Scripture can validate Scripture. And Scripture shares in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13, where Abram was during the period of the Abrahamic covenant. Let us read Genesis chapter 14, verse 13. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner. And these were confederate with Abram. Also, Scripture also shares in Genesis chapter 37, verses 13 through 14, that this is where Jacob, Israel, was before going into Goshen in Egypt. Let us read. Genesis chapter 37, verse 13 reads, And Israel said unto Joseph, Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, Here am I. Genesis chapter 37, verse 14. And he said to him, Go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren, and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. At the time Jacob, Israel, was leaving to go into Goshen, into Egypt, it was during the fourth generation. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac begot Jacob, Israel. Jacob, Israel begot his 12 sons. And the fourth generation is these 12 sons begot sons. Jacob, Israel, and all of his seed, with the exception of Joseph, were exactly where Abram was during the Abrahamic covenant. This validates that Isaac's son Esau was not a part of the Abrahamic covenant as Isaac's seed, because Esau and his seed were not in Hebron during the fourth generation. Scripture also shares with us that Hebron was the land of the Amorites in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13. Now let me be very clear. The Ruach Kadesh, the Spirit which is holy, will lead us all into all truth. My commission, my assignment is to grow and move from just knowing to truly understanding, and then sharing understanding to all that have ears to hear and eyes to see. My prayer is that we all make informed decisions. But this can only be done when we are presented with as much of the facts, understanding, and guidance from the Ruach Kadesh, the Spirit which is holy, that we're able to obtain. We've highlighted key parts of this prophecy. Now let us investigate what we have highlighted in order to move from just knowing to truly understanding this prophecy. As we stated earlier, virtually everyone has been told of the story of Israel's 400 years of enslavement in Egypt and their triumphant exodus out. As we grow and move from just knowing to understanding Scripture, let us examine closely how the story lines up to understanding the prophecy given in the Scripture. We have allowed Scripture to validate Scripture, that the seed referenced in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 is Jacob, Israel. We now will examine Israel being a stranger in a land that was not theirs. The Hebrew definition for stranger is sojourner, stranger, foreigner, a person living out of his own country. The land of Israel actually bordered Egypt. Abram himself actually spent time in Egypt. When the famine was in the land, Jacob Israel sent his sons to Egypt to buy corn. Egypt was not a foreign or strange land to the seed of Abraham or anyone else living in the land of Canaan. It would have been like the U.S. and Mexico today. Each is a different country, but they're not strangers to one another. Next, let us examine that Jacob Israel would serve the people in the land that was not theirs and be afflicted by the people of that land. We have come to understand that Jacob Israel and his descendants would be slaves and afflicted. We have come to understand afflicted means to bestow labor upon anything, to be afflicted, oppressed, depressed. And it would be for 400 years. Note, Scripture shares that Abraham's seed does not enter Egypt enslaved, nor afflicted, oppressed, nor depressed in Genesis chapter 47, verses 5 and 6. Genesis chapter 47, verse 5 reads, "And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, Thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee." Genesis chapter 47, verse 6. "The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land, make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen, let them dwell. And if thou knowest any men of activity among them, then make them rulers over my cattle." Let us allow Scripture to validate the when. The time Abraham's seed was in Egypt before they were enslaved. Scripture shares that Jacob Israel was 130 years old when he and his seed first went into Goshen in Egypt. In Genesis chapter 47, verses 8 through 9. Let us read. Genesis chapter 47, verse 8. "And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, How old art thou?" Genesis chapter 47, verse 9. "And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." Scripture reveals that Jacob Israel lived in Egypt for 17 years, dying at 147 years of age. In Genesis chapter 47, verse 28, let us read. "And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the whole age of Jacob was 147 years." The scripture does not tell us specifically how old Jacob Israel was when Joseph was born. But this is important to know to determine exactly when the children of Israel actually go into slavery. As always, Scripture will validate Scripture. As we move from just knowing to understanding Scripture, it reveals Jacob Israel was no younger than 74 and no older than 76 years old when Joseph was born. Now, there are two ways to arrive at this age. First, by understanding when Jacob Israel left for Padan Aram. And secondly, by how old Joseph was when he stood before Pharaoh. It is imperative that we understand Scripture in order to arrive at the correct years. Let us first determine how old Jacob was when he left for Padan Aram. In determining when Jacob Israel left for Padan Aram, we must examine and understand Scripture. We need to understand Genesis chapter 16, verse 16, sharing with us how old Abram was when Ishmael was born. Genesis chapter 16, verse 16. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. Next, scripture shares in Genesis 17:17 that Isaac was 14 years younger than Ishmael. Genesis chapter 17:17. Then Abram fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, that is 90 years old, bear? Lastly, Genesis chapter 25 verse 26 shares that Isaac was 60 years of age when Esau and Jacob were born. Genesis 25:26. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. Genesis chapter 28 verse 9 is a timestamp because it shares Ishmael was still living. And Ishmael lived to be 137 years old according to Genesis chapter 25 verse 17. It reads, and these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. And he gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people. Let us read Genesis chapter 28 verse 9. Then went Esau unto Ishmael, and took unto the wives which he had Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth, to be his wife. Around this time is when Jacob left for Padan Aram. So we can establish approximately how old Jacob was based on what we now understand. First, let us establish the age of Isaac. We know Ishmael lived to be 137. We need to subtract the total age of Ishmael, which was 137, from how much older he was than his half-brother Isaac, 14 years, equaling 123. This would make Isaac no older than 123 years old at this time. Remember, we established how old Isaac was when Esau and Jacob were born, 60. Now we can determine Jacob's age. Subtracting Isaac's age at this time of 123 years old from his age when Esau and Jacob were born of 60 years old. This would make Jacob no more than 63 years of age when he left for Padan Aram. Scripture shares Jacob Israel was in Padan Aram 13 years before Joseph was born, and reveals that Jacob served Laban in Padan Aram 7 years for Rachel. Let us look into scripture in Genesis chapter 29 verse 20. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her. Let us read now Genesis chapter 29 verse 25. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? Genesis chapter 29 verse 27. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. Genesis chapter 29 verse 28. And Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. And he gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. Scripture is sharing that after Laban tricked Jacob into taking Leah as his wife instead of Rachel, Laban tells Jacob that if he serves him an additional 7 years, Laban will give Jacob both of his daughters. Let us pick up in Genesis chapter 30 verse 22. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. Genesis chapter 30 verse 23. And she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. Genesis chapter 30 verse 24. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. Genesis chapter 30 verse 25. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go into mine own place, into my country. Genesis chapter 30, verse 26. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. Scripture shows Jacob clarifying that he has served his 2 7-year periods unto Laban, a total of 14 years. But note that Jacob does not speak to Laban about leaving until after Joseph is born. So Joseph is born before the 14 years, approximately a year before, in Jacob's 13th year of servitude. Jacob Israel was no more than 63 years old when he entered into Padan Aram. This would make Jacob Israel no more than 76 years of age when Joseph is born. This establishes Jacob's age of when Joseph was born by establishing when Jacob went to Padan Aram. This will conclude part 1. We will pick up next week with the 400-year prophecy part 2 and talk about the second method of determining how old Jacob Israel was when Joseph was born. I would like to invite you to fellowship and worship the Sabbath with the Ecclesia every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. In addition, please join the Ecclesia every Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for prayer. The link for both is provided on His Servant's website. Something to think about. If you're seeking a blessing, be a blessing. If this episode of Something to Think About has been a blessing, assist us with your time, talents, and finances in continuing to grow and move from just knowing to truly understanding the word of the Most High, Yahweh Elohim. Peace and blessings.
His servant encourages you and prays that you will continue with him on the journey of growing and moving from just knowing to understanding the word of the Most High, Yahweh Elohim. To support you on your journey, his servant offers the following resources. His servant email address. Please feel free to reach out to his servant at any time with any questions, concerns, suggestions, and/or comments. His servant website and his servant YouTube channel. You are encouraged to subscribe to be alerted of new content. In addition, his servant recommends reading or listening to the beginning of Scriptural Truth, Volume 1. It affords a strong beginning foundation in not just knowing, but understanding the Scripture.